I have been collecting these stories for many years. Some I heard from old hunters at the table in an abandoned winter hut, others from geologists who had long since quit their jobs and still returned in their thoughts to those summer roots. There were also those that were in yellowed journals with neat notes in the margins, where the author's name is no longer legible. One thing unites them. They all come from the taiga, not from settlements, not from hunting outposts. Namely, from those places where a person's foot rarely sets foot, where at night you can only hear your own breathing rhythm and the crackling of a fire, where it is not you who establishes order, but the forest. The people who shared these memories were not storytellers. Geologists, fishermen, foresters, and hunters. All of them were accustomed to the precision and dry language of work. Their words do not sound like fiction, but rather like a dry statement of fact. A fire that burned too correctly, steps that only had a mechanical evenness and a directionless whisper. They didn't like to talk much, but what was said was remembered for a long time. I'm not saying that everything happened exactly as described, but I know one thing. Each of those who shared these stories believed in their words and never returned to where it happened. Here are several stories. They are all part of the memory of the taiga. If suddenly while reading it seems to you that the room has become quieter than it should be, or that someone's gaze lingers outside the window, don't be surprised. This happens to those who once heard someone else's steps in the night forest and could no longer forget their rhythm. The first story is written down from the words of geologist Viktor Petrov, north of Krasnoyarsk Krai, July 1977. The area between the nameless tributaries of the middle reaches of the Yenisei, a cedar forest interspersed with larch, gently undulating terrain with outcrops of gray sandstones. We were on schedule, as befits a field team, in a normal summer. The weather was fair for these places. White clouds, rare drizzling showers, annoying mosquitoes, a persistent smell of moss from the ground, warm to the desired softness. The route stretched from ridges of low hills with gray sandstones to a low floodplain, where the dark water of a tributary emerged from the bushes, stretching in lazy loops to a large channel. The work was ordinary. Lay pits and depressions, take samples on pebbles, check the previously noted outcrop of argillites. The framework of the day was based on repetitive actions, and in such conditions the head is not inclined to invent unnecessary things. We saw the place I want to tell you about closer to evening. The dry channel, which in spring had obviously carried a fast stream, had become a whitish strip strewn with rounded stones by July. To the side of this strip, at the dark edge of the cedar forest, there was a small convex plateau of sandstone, on which traces of a camp could be discerned. An extinguished fire pit, 2 ruts from what had once been a hut or light tents, thin pockets of earth with burns. There are many such places in the taiga. Usually you see a few sticks, the blackness of ash, empty jars with remnants of enamel. Here it was different. Everything that fell into the light spot of this plateau seemed to be discolored. The fire pit did not turn black, but lay in an ashen circle. The stones around seemed powdered, and the wooden fragments in all the places where the red core is normally preserved looked outward with a matte, almost chalky shade. Even the charred branches, if you ran your fingers over them, did not leave the usual black mark, and your fingers remained dry and clean, like after chalk that does not stick. I ran a knife along the edge of one fragment and got a dry rustle without a resinous note. There was no smell of hairy in the air, although the shape of the hearths was clear, regular with traces of crossbars. The birds were flying higher at that moment and did not dare to sit on the edge. We stood without talking, since sometimes one glance is enough for everyone to understand. In front of us was not a man-made oddity, but a place that lacked the usual trifle. No one endowed it with words. We simply made a circle along the perimeter, noting the details. I found an area nearby where the grass inside the spot grew evenly, uniformly, as if it had been trimmed with a ruler in the spring, and further it maintained this level, although nearby in the shade of the woodshed the ears of grass stretched higher. In one pocket of earth lay the bones of a small animal, probably a hare, but they were also whiter than usual and did not give off the natural greasy mat. If I had seen this at the quarry, I would have thought about a splash from the West River waters. But underfoot lay sandstone with thin clay layers and small gravel, and the water of the tributary was dark, without a sign of whitish inclusions. We did not set up camp inside the spot. This decision was made without discussion. The tents were set up 400 meters down the channel, where the bank was covered by bushes, and there was room for a dryer near the fire. The evening went as usual. We cleaned our boots, laid out the poles, verified the line we had passed on the map and wrote down the daily amount in the log. Inside my head, however, there remained a steady anxiety, similar to the feeling when you observe something correct and beautiful, but you understand that in this correctness there is an extra, alien part, inexplicable by a set of familiar factors. I attributed it to fatigue, especially since ahead was an ordinary overnight stay and a short window of sleep, which always seems luxurious in the summer. At night, a sound came to us. It was not loud, and it did not break through the fabric of the tents. It was a dry hum, as if a large transformer was working somewhere far away. Such a sound usually nests in the ears, and not in the air. It did not vibrate objects, did not shake dishes and did not echo in the guy lines of the tents. It was simply smooth, like a backlight. I thought that somewhere in the riverbed on a large current there was a large movement of water, and this background was creeping into the hollow. But after a minute I realized that it was impossible to determine the direction. It was neither to the left nor to the right, and it was not from above. It filled the space like fog. Sleep became even, but not deep, as if the air pressure had changed and the body had switched to a different breathing pattern. At the same moment, another sign was added. A crunch, similar to walking on a winter crust. The sound was dry, with a short break. And this was happening in the middle of summer on an open channel, where there were pebbles and moss underfoot. I lay and counted the pauses between steps and tried to build a trajectory. The pauses did not add up straight. They went in circles, sometimes close, sometimes further, sometimes falling silent, as if the walker was listening to himself. When you get up at night to go outside and assess what is happening, you are always afraid of introducing an extra factor. I did not get up, because I understood that now everything I did would be interpreted by the head as it wanted. In the morning, we saw prints around the tents. There were few of them, 10, maybe 12. On the sand, sprinkled with light dust from the ash, there were depressions of an elongated shape, as if a thin board had been pressed into the surface under the weight of a person. The edges held an acute angle, and inside the depression there was no usual crumb that always forms when the walls crumble. One of the depressions on the edge of the bush stretched further under the branches, without changing the width, as if the support was the same along its entire length. I put my palm to scale and realized that the width was greater than a ski and less than a human foot, and the depth was greater than a light step should make. If it had been an animal, I would have seen claw marks or at least an unevenness from the support on the soft part of the paw. Everything here was equally dry and sharp. In the sun, such prints would not have been preserved for long, but the morning was covered with a whitish veil, and by midday the shape held. We again went to the white plateau. The birds still held their altitude and did not descend to its edges. The air did not contain the usual smell of a resting fire. On one of the stones lay a neat round fragment of tree bark. Perhaps from a larch. I tried to rub the bark between my fingers. It crumbled into a light dust, without giving off a resinous stickiness. We took several photographs, marked the coordinates on the map, decided not to linger and returned to our tasks higher up the tributary. As we descended to our camp, we saw a thin local fog emerging from the floodplain, not high enough to reach a person's waist. It was motionless, without streams, and stood like liquid poured into a mold. During the day, we lost 2 compasses while working, not in the sense of losing objects, but in the sense of a function failure. The arrows spun for a short time and then froze, indicating nothing intelligible, as if they were placed on an iron-rich vein. The terrain, however, did not provide grounds for such behavior. No magnetite rulers, no strong iron crack. I took out the 3rd old compass with a scratched cover, and it worked, but behaved sluggishly. The arrow seemed to get stuck in a dense medium. We took out the directions by the sun and by the map, continued testing, and by evening managed to cross to the other side, where the cedar forest goes higher, and underfoot there are stripes of dry lichen. The second night reminded me of the first, but added a new effect. Sleep did not come as the usual warm immersion, but came like holding your breath. Inside, it was too light. In the silence there was a hum again, and over it there was a barely perceptible melodic ringing, not like bells, but as if nails were slowly drawn along a smooth iron strip. This sound had no beginning and no end. It was as if it had always been there. I lay, and the duration of the night was felt not as time, but as a segment between 2 different states of air. Somewhere around 4, the fog cover crept up to the tents. It was dry in appearance, like dust from white stone. When dawn broke, a chalky coating remained on the guy ropes. We ran our fingers through it, and the dry flour felt on our skin, but the trail was not clearly imprinted, as if it did not want to move. In the morning, small things disappeared. The knife with the red handle, which I had left on the tarpaulin near the food bag, lay 2 steps away from the place. It was slightly in the sand, with no traces that would explain its movement. One of the measuring tapes had gone to the bushes and lay in the grass in a smooth arc, as if it had been carefully removed and put down slowly. The soot had disappeared from the pot, although the fire was alive and the wood was resinous. I checked the ash pan near our fire. The ash was gray, regular, but for some reason dry to the touch, without that greasy note that is always there after a normal night of cooking. The neighboring peg, on which I was drying my socks, was driven in a few centimeters deeper than the day before, although the guy line did not tighten. It was a trifle, but the head notices such things, since they do not need to be invented. By midday, the junior technician's health worsened. He complained of a viscous zivot that did not lead to sleep, of an unpleasant, heavy hearing, as if there was cotton wool in his ears, wet and cold. I gave him something hot to drink to ease his condition a little. Then we adjusted the plan and decided to go up the tributary. And there, on the first convenient ledge, we set up camp, so that in the morning we could finally decide whether to continue working near this line. When we were packing up camp, the landscape around us seemed flatter than usual. Small shadows disappeared, and large things, tents, cedars, boulders seemed to have come closer to each other. It is not an optical trick, but a sensation that is difficult to convey, as if someone removed half the details from the picture and the brain stopped measuring distance in the usual way. We did not enter the white spot a second time, but moved in a parallel line, glancing back and forth more often than necessary. The fog clung to the lowlands, motionless, like liquid poured into the hollows. In the evening, we stopped at a convenient place without any special features. It was just a dry edge with a smooth line of bushes and sandstone blown by the wind. After that, the familiarity returned partially. The hum died down, as if a switch was flipped. Sleep came without resistance. The morning, however, began with the feeling that someone was walking around the camp. On the edge, we saw 2 elongated prints. Identical in length and depth, and they disappeared under the bushes, like yesterday. I wanted to find an explanation in the human factor. At night, one of ours could get up, touch something, move the tape and put an unnecessary step. But a person usually leaves a trail of understandable small traces around himself, and here there were none. There was only what I wanted to call a print, and a short chain of whitish crumbs, as if dry dust had settled from a peg to the edge. We left those places without loud decisions, without arguments and without big words. In the diary I noted the coordinates, made a note about the strange behavior of the compasses, and also sketched a diagram of the plateau and the shape of the spot. There are several frames left on the film, where the whiteness is not as noticeable as with the eye, but the fire pit looks unnaturally smooth and devoid of soot. In the following years, I sometimes turned onto similar channels and checked myself, whether a memory substitution had occurred. The places were different, there were empty campsites and faded fire pits. But everything was explained by the time of year, washing out, wind and an ordinary forest passage. But that section was different in that all the signs were too correct in one place and at one time, as if the drawing had been handed over under guard and someone was looking after it. Years later, one of the workers from that batch quit geology and went into carpentry. He didn't say that those few nights were the reason. He talked about family, the city, and the fatigue of the seasonal pitching. I only remember how he described his dreams after that summer, as if he were walking on a white crust in July and something crunched under his feet that shouldn't be there. He didn't talk about faceless people or ghosts. He simply said that in some places the taiga doesn't tolerate excess paint and therefore makes everything colorless so that nothing lingers. I don't know what it was. Direct explanations can be gathered. Local water chemistry, the release of fine mineral dust, because of which everything looks bleached. Some magnetic anomalies that are found in those latitudes. A fine mist of fine aerosols that leaves a dry coating on things. You can put them together and get a picture that your hands reach for, but there will remain a sound that had no direction. Shadows that disappeared for no apparent reason, a white spot where no birds went, and prints that did not resemble either paws or human souls. And this is enough to remember that place, like special lines on a map that you do not want to go to next time. If you ask me if I will return there, I will answer simply. The taiga has places where it keeps something of its own that does not need witnesses. We, who have a hammer and a ribbon in our hands, know how to accept it as part of the landscape, along with deadwood, wind and rain. We set up a tent to the side, do our work and leave so as not to change someone else's order. The white parking lot remained on my map without a signature. I know it by the imaginary line of the channel and by the smooth noise that is heard somewhere inside the head, if you imagine that evening, and this is enough. The second story. This story happened to the fisherman Nikolai Maslov in March 1984. The scene is the Yakut Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, a small tributary of the Lena, north of the village of Pelejui. Spring comes slowly to these places. The sun has been holding on longer, the shadows have become softer, but the frost is such that in the mornings your breath settles on your collar, and the snow on the edge of the rivers rings under your boots. At the end of March, the ice is still strong and thick, but at midday the top layer melts, and the water collects in small puddles, ceasing again at night. The three of us got together to go fishing. My neighbor Stepan, his brother-in-law Arkady and I decided to go to a tributary of the Lena about 20 kilometers from the village. It is a remote place, people rarely go there, but there is plenty of fish. In winter, people go there on dogs, and in spring, when the snow settles, you can get there on foot with backpacks. We took a tent, a small stove, gear and a dog, a yew-tree cable dog, half a husky, smart and faithful. The journey took almost a day. The snow melted, and our feet sank, but we walked in silence, each at our own pace. Backpacks weighed down our shoulders, the frost cracked in our ears, and only the river pleased the eye when it appeared through the trees. a dark ribbon under a thick layer of ice, covered with crust and covered with dry snow. We chose a place a little higher upstream, where the riverbed widened and the bank formed a small cape. The ice there was especially smooth, without hummocks, and it was comfortable to stand on it. First, we cleared the snow, put up a tent, strengthened the guy ropes and hung a tarpaulin curtain at the entrance. Inside, we laid spruce branches and set up a stove. By evening, while it was still light, we made holes, set up the tip-ups and left them for the night. We didn't light a fire so as not to attract attention with smoke. We sat inside the tent, ate dried fish soup and drank boiling water. The conversations were the most ordinary ones, about neighbors, about prices, about how the men in the village were lazy at logging. We laughed and argued, but the laughter was muffled, because the air there was special, quiet and dense. Even the dog didn't run on the ice, as usual, but stayed close all the time, lay down at our feet and guarded the door. When we went to bed, everything was quiet. The ice under the tent seemed reliable, although in the dark you always remember that there is a river beneath you. In my half-sleep, I heard a crack. At first I thought it was a log in the stove, but no, the sound was different, deep and drawn out. The ice beneath us seemed to be breathing, and this breathing went deep. I sat up and woke Stepan. He heard it too. Arkady turned and froze, as if listening. The cracking died down, but in its place a strange hum appeared, not loud, not like the roar of the wind. Most of all, it resembled a distant human whisper, many-voiced, as if several people were talking at the same time under thick glass. It was impossible to make out the words. The language was unknown. Sometimes it seemed that one voice was laughing, another was responding, a third was interjecting something sharp. The whisper came from below, not from the side, not from the forest, but straight from the depths under the ice. We sat, not daring to speak. Even the dog raised its head, whined quietly and hid in a corner. And suddenly a new sound appeared in this whisper. A woman's cry, at first quiet, as if from far away, then closer, drawn out, with sobs, turning into a groan. The crying would come closer to the tent and then go away. And at some point it seemed to me that someone was sobbing at full volume right underneath me. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear it myself. We didn't go outside. Everyone knew that if we opened the shelf, we would see something. Arkady clutched his head with his hands. Stepan whispered prayers, stumbling mid-sentence. I just sat and listened, and everything inside me grew cold, as if I had gone out into the cold again. The crying lasted for about half an hour, and then died down. I tried to fall asleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The echo was heard under the ice all the time, even when it was quiet. In the morning we went to check the tip-ups. There were almost no fish. But right next to the tent we saw something strange. In the transparent layer of ice, frozen half a finger below the surface, a handprint was visible, as if someone had put it on from below. The fingers were long and thin, and the palm was elongated, neither a man's nor a child's. I crouched down and touched it. The ice was smooth, without cracks. The track could not have appeared just like that. We exchanged glances, but no one said anything. During the day, everything seemed calm. The sun was shining brightly, squirrels were running through the forest, and the dog became a little more lively. But there was a lurking anxiety in each of us. We were silent more than usual. And when we were collecting firewood for the stove, I caught myself turning around every 10 steps. The second night began worse. As soon as we lay down, the ice began to ring again, but this time not with a crack, but with a thin sound, like the creaking of a metal string. Immediately after the new sound, the whisper returned. It became clearer, as if someone was deliberately pronouncing the words with pauses and intonations, as in speech. Then we heard the crying again. Now it was closer than before. I felt the floor twitching under me. The dog was howling in the corner, and that made things even worse. Suddenly there was a splash, loud and heavy, as if a log had fallen into the water. Then another, and after that there was a wheezing sound, as if someone was trying to get out and was scratching. Arkady couldn't stand it, he jumped up and ran out. Stepan and I rushed after him. The moon was shining on the ice so that everything was visible as if it were daytime. Arkady was standing about 20 meters away and shouting that there were people underneath him. We ran up. Something was indeed moving under the transparent ice. Dark silhouettes, long and thin, slowly floating, as if in thick water. They didn't look like fish, they looked like people, but with disproportionately long arms. We grabbed Arkady and led him back. He was shaking all over, and his teeth were chattering. Until the morning he sat, without lying down, and looked into the corner. At dawn we broke camp, abandoned the tip-ups and somehow assembled the tent. It was hard to walk, because every step on the ice was accompanied by the fear that that very cry would be heard under our feet. Arkady did not say a word the entire way. Soon, in the village, Arkady began to tell us that he had seen shadows without faces under the ice. We did not argue. A couple of years later, he gave up fishing altogether. He said that at night he still heard women crying, as if someone was calling him by name. Local elders assured us that a boat with women and children who were evacuated down the river sank in those places during the war. Others said that there was an old camp of drowned people there, who were washed away by a flood in the spring. No one could give an exact explanation. I myself did not go there anymore. But every spring, when the ice begins to crack, that cry returns to my head, thin and drawn out, as if someone was crying right under you in the dark. Story 3. This story is written down from the words of the fisherman Semyon Tagayev, Southern Yakut ASSR, February 1965. The scene is the watershed between the right bank tributaries of the Veloy and the northern spurs of the Verkhnyangarsky Ridge. Winter camp on an old logging run. We came to this camp at the end of January, when the frosts were persistent and the passage in the taiga was dense, and daylight was still short. The camp was simple. Winter quarters with 4 bunks, a small vestibule, a dryer under the ceiling and a door with a homemade latch. Behind the house there was a snow-filled ditch for chips, and a little lower there was a site where it was convenient to make an open fire if you did not want to smoke in the hut. All around there was a cedar forest, mixed with spruce and rare larch on dry ridges. The snow rang underfoot like thin tin, and only in the lowlands did we encounter the ill-fated powder, into which our legs sank up to our knees. There were 4 of us, me, Fyodor, Arseny and Yegor. With us were 2 Laika dogs. They lived on chains by the wall, but more often they stretched out under the bunks if the stove burned for a long time. The first 2 weeks passed smoothly, as any normal work in the forest does. In the morning, you need to light the stove, dry the mittens, brew tea, blow out the fire along the line and blow through the loops and traps. By midday, we were busy making a fire near the fire pit to warm ourselves up and not waste firewood from the supplies, and by evening we returned with the catch, butchered it, salted it, hung up the meat and prepared chips for tomorrow. The dogs worked properly, their noses held up confidently. Night came, as normal fatigue comes. In those days, a fire was not a ritual for us, but an ordinary thing. Level the hull from the last time, lay dry cedar logs, put thin chips on one side to blow through, and wait for the fire to straighten out and start working with an even tongue. The fire in such a fire is stone, holds its shape, does not dust and gives a warm wall, behind which it is comfortable to sit, mend belts, sharpen knives and rewind bandages on the shin. The 3rd week was windy, and the snow became different, prickly and glassy. In the evening, when we sat by the fire, we felt that the air in the run seemed to have become thicker. The fire was burning evenly, but the sparks did not fly upwards, but somehow stretched out to one side and went out at the ground. We then thought about the draft, about the fact that the edge of the forest holds the side wind. That night the dogs did not go under the bunk, on the contrary, they lay down closer to the entrance, but their muzzles were not turned towards us, but towards the darkness, where a dense spruce forest began behind the fire. I remember how one of the dogs crunched a tooth on a dry lump of snow. She clenched her jaws, as if she wanted to suppress the sound. We burned the fire down to dark coals, brought a wineskin with water into the hut, hung up the mittens and lay down. That night I woke up not from the sound, but from its absence. In the frost, the taiga produces a thin mesh of noise. Somewhere a branch will move, somewhere the ice in the nearest ditch will snap, and somewhere dry snow will fall under the wall. That night the mesh snapped, as if someone had squeezed it with their fingers. I sat down and listened, not moving my shoulders so as not to rustle my quilted jacket. And then, behind the wall, where the fire pit stands during the day, I heard the noise of footsteps, very even and rare, not fast and not heavy. There were identical pauses between the steps, as if someone were counting to themselves and moving in the same rhythm. The dogs did not bark. They went under the bunks, and there they began that silent trembling, when an animal's entire body vibrates, but not a single muscle makes a sound. There was enough time for me to understand that this was not an animal, an elk, a deer, a bear. Each has its own manner. Here the manner was human, but too slow for a man in felt boots in the frost. The morning returned to the usual picture. Frost on the nails, pour on the door latch, dry warm ash by the stove, dogs sniffing the air, as if nothing had happened. We came out to the fire pit. We had packed the snow down from the previous days. A needle-like crust was visible at the edges. There were no tracks that we would have liked to see. Only near the stones where we usually sat, a short line stretched in very narrow and deep holes. As if someone had leaned on a thin, heavy end, always moving it to the same point on the body. I thought about a staff, but people's staffs sometimes have imprints from a ring, a knot, a chip. Here the depressions were identical and clean, as if the metal had entered the snow at the same angle and with the same weight each time and had come out just as smoothly. We continued working, because work is the best defense against what the head starts to come up with. During the day I caught myself examining the edge between the trunks more closely than necessary. By evening we lit a fire again. I made it denser than usual, placing the logs in a wall. The fire straightened out, smoothed the surface and gave that same smooth, warm strip that you get used to when hunting. At some point, when the fire was getting stronger, we saw how the flame on the thin chips laid on the left began to stretch not upwards, but towards the dark spruce forest. Only not the whole fire, not tongues of flame, but an edge of warmth, as if someone was pulling it with an invisible draft. I moved the log and checked if there was a draft below. There was no draft. A cold appeared on my cheek, although this should not be from the fire. And then, at the very edge of the light, in the place where the fire stops touching objects, something appeared that we later called the guard. It was not a body or a shadow from a tree. It was an emptiness of form, as if an oblong piece was cut out of the night, put on its feet and left standing. The height was higher than a man's height, and the width was narrower than the shoulders, but not so much as to resemble a pillar. The eyes, if you can call them that, did not shine with a reflection, but resembled cold points that did not give off a beam. The fire in them did not hang, as it does in the eyes of an animal, but seemed to be deaf. The air around became denser and drier, and the sound from a spark that fell from a log did not reach the ear at full length. We did not discuss this out loud. In such cases, words are both unnecessary and dangerous. They arrange things, and this is not always useful. The dogs were already under the bunks, they were not visible, you could only hear how they tried to take a deeper breath than they could. We brought the fire to a level where the heat holds, but the flame does not move, and went into the hut. At night, footsteps were heard again, even, with equal pauses, sometimes so close to the wall that the wood responded with a light, dry creaking, like heated shingles under snow. The next morning added a new detail. At the edge, where we usually put a bucket of water, the snow was pressed down into two oval depressions. They were located as if someone had stood, transferred their weight and froze again. The depressions were not from a ski shoe or a ski block. There was no pattern inside that would show the material of the sole. The edges were sharp, as if an ice knife had cut off the wall. A person does not stand like that on January snow, even if he takes off the boot and stays in the sock. The heel takes shape, and the toe pulls the crumbs. There was no shape here. The following days went by with repetition, work, a fire, silence and night steps. But the repetition did not calm, but knew how to cut off strength. We began to tire differently. Sleep ceased to bring the softness that usually comes in the forest after a long day. Dreams became the same, as if someone was standing at the edge of the bunk, not bending over or moving, and watching without blinking. There was no face, but there was a presence that pressed on your breathing. You wake up, and it is dark in the hut. The stove gives off a dim orange light, and for a second it seems that you have not woken up, but have fallen to the same level, where there is simply no sound. In the morning your head is clear, as after a healthy frost, but inside there remains an empty depression, similar to the one where you left your staff by the fire. Once Fyodor decided to go out at the very moment when the guard was standing closer than usual. I heard how he quietly lifted the latch, how the snow under his felt boot gave a short glass crunch, and how for a moment everything that defined the boundaries of the place fell silent. He returned a minute later, said nothing and sat down by the wall, holding his palms on his knees. His shoulder trembled slightly for a while until he put a hot glove heated over the stove on it. Later, when we were sorting out the belts, he took a knife and spent a long time straightening the edge, although it no longer required straightening. It was obvious that he was trying to distract himself and at least do something with his hands. There was no panic in his eyes. There was that understanding that comes in the taiga and does not come in the city. You stayed together, where the order is not yours, but for now they tolerate you. One night, the guard came very close to the edge of the light. The fire reached out to it, as if to emptiness, and died out halfway. The sparks that usually come out from under the log with a jerk and fly upwards, this time fell low, passed in an arc and died out near the ground. The air in the strip between us and the guard cooled before our eyes, not in the sense of temperature, but in the sense of that dry cold that is in a cellar, dull, odorless. I noticed how the web on the cedar knot closest to us stopped twitching. It is barely visible in the frost. It usually moves from the slightest draft. That time it lay like a wet thread. Inside, the excess moment was neither darker nor lighter, but a thin sound appeared in the ear, as if you hear how someone tightens the lid on a glass jar tightly. And that same night, the steps near the wall became less frequent, but closer. And for a second it seemed to me that someone was running something very hard along the logs, without leaving a scratch. In the following days, we began to shift the schedule. The fire was lit earlier and led into the coals until complete darkness. In the hut, we kept watch by the stove, throwing in more often than necessary. The dogs had gotten into the habit of sleeping under the shelves where the salt sacks were. It was easier for them there. On the third day of this regime, Arseny, who usually slept easily, sat for a long time, tapping his finger on the edge of the table, and still could not find anything to do. Then he got up, carefully put the old ski wax, which he had not used for years, into his backpack, and put it back in the same way. I saw in such movements not fear, but an attempt to regain the length of the gesture, so that the body would remember the sequence again. By the middle of the fourth week, a new line of depressions had appeared in the snow near the fire pit. Now they went not only along the stones, but also on the approach to the hut. Between the depressions there was an even, almost drawing distance. Sometimes a pair of ovals turned out to be closer, as if the one who was moving lingered in place and shifted the support from one pin to another. We did not find a single print of a human foot, not a single trace of a felt boot, and not a single random crumb that could be read as our pattern. Only these narrow, uniform in width, too deep for a light object, pits without ribs. There's a simple rule in hunting. Do not stay in a place that begins to explain itself instead of you. If the fire at the campfire is burning in a way that is not its nature, go to another run. If the dog changes its manner without reason and holds its muzzle towards the darkness longer than necessary, change the camp. And if sleep stops working, change the schedule and coordinates. We decided to change the camp the next day, put some of the things on the sleds and go to a reserve point 3 marches to the northeast. It was on a dry hillock, where there is usually a smooth wind in the winter. This choice was made not because someone was scared, but because the place became not ours, but someone else's. And to use it against the will of the owner means to break the forest order. The night before leaving was the quietest. We lit a fire during the day, brought it to heavy coals and did not go out anymore. The Isbazar held, the stove flap slammed, and there was enough firewood without greed. The dreams came the same, but they were shorter. In the morning we went out and saw that the snow near the fire was smooth, as if climbed out by the wind. The lines of depressions went from the stones to the spruce forest and dissolved in the shadow, no closer, no further. Under the wall of the hut it was clean, only on the edge, where we usually put the pot, 2 fresh ovals remained. We did not look for any other meaning in them, except for the one we already knew. Someone came, stood and watched, without interfering. The fire at this camp was no longer needed. Soon we left. The transition was long, but smooth. Occasionally, the same empty form that came to the fire would appear at the edge of my vision. Not as a vision, but as a test. Wouldn't it be nice to turn my head? I didn't. In the new place, everything fell into its usual groove. The fire was sending sparks upward again. The dogs were sleeping by the door and asking to go outside. As usual, sleep had returned. Only sometimes, when a log would fall through the fire with a rustle, it seemed that there, beyond the edge of the light, someone was standing and simply waiting for the fire to start reaching out in his direction again. Since then, I have treated fires differently. Fire is not only warmth. It is a border where you are seen, even if you don't see anyone. There are enough places in the taiga where the fire serves you and works honestly and without someone else's shadow. But there are such points as that camp on the run, where a guard comes to the fire. He does not touch and does not demand. He just looks. And from his gaze the air becomes dry, the sparks die out near the ground, and the dogs choose the semi-darkness under the shelves instead of the warm corner by the door. If you stay there longer than you should, you begin to confuse your points of support with his, then smooth depressions appear by the fire where there should be no traces of us. This means that the place asks for silence without people. I do not believe in fairy tales. I do not like stories about black people and other fairground fears. In my world there is snow, fire, white silence and an order of things that we do not establish, but accept. That watchman by the fire is part of this order. He comes when the fire is collected correctly, when the night is dry and indifferent, when a person has already entered the forest to that depth where words interfere. I saw him up close only once, and felt him for many nights. But this is enough to no longer stay in those camps where the fire reaches into the darkness, and not into the sky. Story 4. I present to you a story that Hunter Ivan Fralov told me. The scene, Krasnoyarsk territory, December 1982. A winter trail between 2 cordons in the upper reaches of the Chulim River tributaries. Winter in those places comes as if it is pushed out of the darkness with both hands, without talking and to the full depth. By November, the snow already lies in an even layer, and by December, that same ringing crust comes that holds a man and a dog. The air becomes dry as chalk. Sounds are cut shorter than in summer, and everything that is not needed falls off by itself. Extra words, extra thoughts and extra movements. I lived alone at the cordon then and tried to follow the routine. A week here, then a move to the neighboring cordon, checking the loops and traps, replenishing salt and firewood and back. The road was familiar. From the hut to the gentle hillock, then along the swamp, where in winter you don't risk falling through, and again into the forest, where the path returns you to human warmth. I got ready without haste, as always. I put salt, bread, cereal, a cast iron pot, spare mittens and a knife in my backpack. I also didn't forget about candles, a box of matches in a canvas bag so that they wouldn't get soggy in my pocket, a 3-row for repairing skis, an old pair of binoculars with a scratched eyepiece, and a paper bundle with dry birch berries. An axe in a case hung on my belt, felt boots with galoshes were worn on my feet, and tight foot wraps were wound over them, as is proper. I had a dog with me, half husky, half mongrel, smart, not a quack. She walked at a free trot, sometimes running ahead 10 meters, sniffing the air. She had a name, but when hunting you usually call her briefly, "Hey," she understands anyway. The day was frosty, dry and transparent. The snow crunched like fresh small shavings under the sole, and the resting trees gave off a thin spark of inia. The silence that I love reigned in the spruce forest. Not because there is nothing in it, but because everything is in its place. Along the way I came across various tracks, a fox's path, light, smooth, a hare jumping over a hummock, mice and passages under the snow crust, giving themselves away as a whole. In one place there was a warm yellow mark on the crust. A sable had recently passed by. I decided for myself that I would return here in my own way, but not today. I reached the old lumberjack's hut by midday. Looking inside, I saw that the roof was holding up, the stove was intact. A rusty spoon was dangling from a nail, just like 10 years ago. Then I had a dry snack and didn't drink any tea. It was a waste of time. Then I walked steadily, as usual, until in the evening, when the moon rose from the gray side of the forest, I came out into the open. A gentle hillock in front of a long isthmus between two spruce forests. There, at a distance of about 50 steps, I saw a man ahead. The figure was walking along my path, hunched over in a sheepskin coat and a fur hat, walking slowly, as if with difficulty, but steadily. In such places in winter you can sometimes meet a fellow traveler. It happens that neighbors are going in the same direction, or a harvester from another cordon. I tried to call him, but the man did not turn around. Then I quickened my pace. I checked the straps on my backpack so that they were not dangling, and walked faster. The dog became alert, sniffed, but stopped barking. This is also a sign. Soon I noticed that the distance between me and my fellow traveler did not change, as if it was held by an elastic band. No matter how far you walked, you could not come close. And then I noticed something simple, but wrong. The man left no traces on Nostia. Where my sole broke the crust with a short crunch, where the dog left clear round holes, the one who walked in front left behind him the snow smooth as a leaf, no dents, no crumbs. I stopped. The dog sat down, pressed his ears and stared ahead. The figure continued to move at the same pace, without looking back, and at the fork where the path goes into the lowland, he turned right and disappeared behind the firs. When I approached the fork, I saw virgin snow, and the place where he turned was smooth as glass. I could have blamed fatigue. In the moonlight, when you are alone, anything can seem. I have seen in my life how people in the cold confuse shadows with people. But this was different. It was indifferently empty. And in this indifference there was something persistent, like resentment at someone else's curiosity. I got on my path and walked further to the hut automatically. I had to get there, I had to light the stove, I had to give the dog something to eat. This is order, and order maintains. The hut greeted me honestly. The dry creak of the latch, dark beams inside, a stove with a crack on the side. I have known it since my youth. I laid out the birch bark, threw in some chips and quickly lit the stove. The hand remembers. The dog lay down at the threshold, putting its head on its paws, not closer to the warmth, but so that it could see the door. You remember this too. Then I ate, boiled the kettle, took off my felt boots, put them out to dry, hung my mittens on a nail and wiped the knife. It became warm inside, like in a pocket. The crackling of the stove was even and regular. I lay down on the bunk, wrapped myself up and began to listen. In such places, sleep comes as a decision. You allow it to come, and it does. But that night it did not come. At first, as expected, I heard the usual sounds, like tree branches crackling from the frost, like chips being chewed in the stove in the corner and drawn in by a hot tongue, like a dog sucking in air without breathing through its mouth. Then it subsided, and that silence came that you hear with your back. A silence in which no sound begins, as if everything that could move had changed its mind. And already in this silence I heard the first creaking of snow behind the threshold, not dense, like that of an animal, not light, like that of a bird, but human, tight, even and with a heavy pause between steps. I got up without lighting a candle and went to the window. It was small, square and fogged up in winter. But here the frost had taken the moisture, and the glass was clean. On the path in the moonlight stood the same silhouette, not closer and not further away, so that I could tell that it was standing. Its shadow did not fall on the snow. It was like a cutout in the night, like a drawn rectangle. No shoulders, no arms, everything was merged. It stands and looks at the door. I stepped back and sat down. The dog quietly scraped its claw on the floor and crawled under the stove. It was a warm place there, but today it had not gone there for warmth. I heard its breath trembling, not squealing or growling, but trembling, as if the air in its throat was shaking. How long did it last? I will not say. I did not look out the window anymore. In the silence, my own sounds became perceptible. How the heart beats in the chest, how the dryness from the smoke sits in the throat, and how the palm grows warm when you bring it to it yourself. There were no more footsteps outside. Once or twice I heard a light creaking, as if someone had moved the snow next to the wall, not pressing, but the way things move without weight. I fell asleep only in the morning, as if I had been turned off by a switch. At dawn the frost pressed harder, under 40, no less. At first the sky was gray, then a strip of pale gold appeared. The smoke from the chimney rose in a column and did not scatter. This meant that there was no wind. I went out onto the porch. The path was clear. Next to the threshold the snow had sunk into an even strip, as if someone had lain down on the crust and pressed in, and then disappeared. The strip was longer than a person's height. No outlines of arms, legs, or head. It was just as if the top layer had been removed and not put back. The edges were sharp, without crumbs. I walked around and looked at it from different angles. Not a shadow, not a spoil heap, not my work. And this is not a joke. People can't do that. It's not that they don't do it, but that they don't know how. Then I took a shovel and covered that strip with fresh snow. Not because I was scared, but because if you leave it, it will see you when you don't want to be seen. A minute later I went into the hut, sat down, poured some tea and stroked the dog. Its fur was dry and hot. The skin twitched under my fingers. I remained sitting by the stove until the blood in my body warmed up. By lunchtime I had packed my backpack. According to the schedule, I had to go further, but I didn't. I went back to my cordon, because the schedule is not about stubbornness, but about reason. The road back was familiar, but I walked it differently. In the spruce forest, more always appears on the edge of vision. A branch swings, and it already seems like a hand, a bush on a hummock and already shoulders. I have been watching this for a long time and usually knock out such thoughts. That day, nothing seemed to be imagining anything. Everything was honest. The figure did not appear 3 steps away, or 50, only in one place, on an open hillock, where I had seen it yesterday. The snow looked smoother than it should have, as if something heavy had passed over it and then returned the surface to its place. At my cordon, I had been stoking the stove in silence for a long time. Fatigue came suddenly, like a blow to the knees. They became cottony, and my hand seemed empty. The dog fell asleep by the door, putting its muzzle on the threshold and squealing in its sleep. There was no one at night, or I did not hear. Sleep came heavy, like a damper. I lowered it and that was it. In the morning, I walked around the yard, looked at the tracks of birds, at the old rope by the wall, and at the log that had fallen off the stack, everything that makes the place yours. And I realized that I would not walk along that line alone anymore, not because I was afraid, but because I did not need to. Later, when the men were returning from distant lines, when they stopped for tea, conversations began. One old man said that I had seen one of those who had not made it. Another waved his hand. The moon, the frost, fatigue. I listened, both cases were right. During the war, all sorts of things happened in these parts, and the transit camps went through the taiga in winter, and the frontline soldiers returned, and the vagabonds walked to nowhere. Some made it, some didn't. People see things more often in winter than in summer. But none of the conversations will explain the smooth stripes in the snow, without edges, without signs. As if something heavier than a person was lying there and suddenly became lighter than air. And no conversation will explain why a dog silently goes under the stove and starts shaking, although in life it had lifted an elk and didn't flinch. Since then, I have developed the habit of returning after dark. If I understand that I won't make it, I go to a spare overnight stop off the trail, away from the direct line where I can be seen. I like to heat the stove until it's quietly hot, without a dancing flame. I close the window at night not with a curtain, but with a board, so that the moon doesn't draw anything extra. And now I always take the dog not to guard, but to see by its behavior when the place begins to explain itself without me. I don't tell this story to everyone. I know the value of words. They grow, just like on a latch. It seems like a thin crust, and then you can't lift a finger. But if they ask, I tell them how it was. I don't look for explanations for this case. In the taiga, explanations are an extra burden. They only make your back hurt. But since that night I understood one thing. There are paths that continue to go without those who walk them. They lead neither to a hut, nor to a neighbor, nor to a living fire. They seem to fall asleep on the go, and then the oncoming step becomes a meeting not with a person, but with the very trace of the one who once did not reach. The path can fall asleep, like an animal falls asleep in a hole or like a river freezes under a crust. In this sleep, it keeps the steps and breath of those who disappeared. And if you linger too long, you can lie down with it, and then your own path will continue to go without you.